Thank you, Johanna, for these kind words. Dear guests, a very warm welcome to Iceland. The weather is beautiful. I was just saying to some of our guests here that this is a special pleasure for us here in Iceland because last year summer didn't arrive. So we have been longing for summer, at least here in Reykjavik, and we are very happy to have this beautiful weather and the strong colors here in Iceland, that they're actually my favorite. This is what Iceland is to me. It's the light and the strong colors. As both our young people and other guests who have spoken here, you all know that Iceland has historically projected itself as a peaceful country and associated itself with non-violent settlements of international disputes. Iceland has now for 10 consecutive years been at the top of the Global Peace Index, which measures the level of peacefulness in 163 countries using both qualitative and quantitative indicators. I think I can say that pacifism enjoys more political support in Iceland than in many other regions of the world. And, as you know also, Iceland does not have a military. Our modern history has not seen armed conflict, and the level of violent crime is relatively low. Still, we have our share of violence in today's world. Iceland, like all other countries, for example, has not managed to eradicate violence against women and girls, as the Me Too movement recently revealed. And with the worldwide levels of gender-based violence, it is hard to state that women anywhere enjoy the peacefulness we all should be entitled to. Despite the established knowledge that women's participation in the peace process increases the likelihood of lasting solutions, and we simply have research that shows that this is a fact, women are still far too underrepresented in peace talks and in general in vital decision-making. We have seen in Iceland in the last weeks a rising awareness and consciousness about climate change. And young people and children in Iceland have been demonstrating every Friday, like in many other European countries and other countries around the world. And I think it's very important and vital that we should embrace that. This is an urge to us, the elder generations, to do something that really will make a difference about climate change. And Iceland has been advocating a collective approach on climate change. And I think personally this is the most pressing issue of today's politics, globally and locally, together with the need to reduce social inequalities. And needless to say, gender equality is often a forgotten factor in the debate about climate change, because women's roles as primary caregivers and providers of food and fuel render them more vulnerable to flooding and drought and other consequences of climate change. We've been talking about peace in Iceland. It has not always been so. For the past few centuries, yes. But, for example, in the 17th century, pirates attacked the Westman Islands. It's a famous event in Icelandic history. Killed a priest, took hostages that spent the next decade in Algiers. This was actually quite a trauma to Icelanders at the time, because then Iceland was going through a phase where we were actually under the rule first of the Norwegian king and then later under the Danish king. But in advance to that, because we lost our independence in the 13th century, actually after decades of civil war in Iceland. The 13th century was not a peaceful century in Iceland. We saw some battles, including a famous sea battle where scores of men died, some episodes where those attacked were women and children, and other people who did not bear arms. And I think it's important for every nation and every culture to learn from its history. And we are so lucky here in Iceland that we have this history written down in our sagas. One of the most known is Sturlungar saga, which describes this armed conflict of mainly 4 clans in Iceland. And the historical works of Sturla Þórðarson, who belonged to one of those clans, Sturlungar, is actually a striking evidence about the effects of violence on people. In one famous scene, he graphically describes the burning of Flugumýri, which was a farm, and ends with his own 14-year-old daughter who had been rescued from the burning estate at the last minute and was, in his words, because in those days people didn't use many words, they used few words and chose them carefully, and he said she was much affected as she was only a child. Another haunting description is the death of Snorri Thorvaldsson, who was only 18 years old when killed and born in the same year as Sturla himself. Sturla knew him personally and 50 years later describes him in detail just before his death, accentuating both his youthful exuberance and aggression and adding the tiny but memorable detail that he used to refer to people with the word my Snorri, as we do in Iceland. We say my Jóhanna, for example. Snorri had himself been involved in violent and wicked deeds, but when he is killed, Sturla highlights his young age and the cruelty of his killing, which includes his foot being cut off for no reason other than cruelty before he is decapitated. And it is so interesting to read this old account because Sturla did not approve of violence, and 13th century people actually experienced the same pain and the same trauma as we do today during violent conflicts. And this actually, after this violent age in Iceland, Iceland lost its independence, and we went under the regime of the Norwegian king and later the Danish king and did not become sovereign again until 1918. So even though we have had peaceful times in the last centuries, we still have this evidence of violence. Now I would like to conclude to talk a little bit about the politics of today, because also as you have been talking about, you don't have to read the papers every day to sense and feel the growing polarization in today's politics where different parties and different political trends prefer to stay in the trenches rather than to have a dialogue and try to solve issues by increased understanding of different views. And in Iceland, we also feel that polarization. But maybe we have taken a little different route, at least right now, these years, because our government is actually a coalition government of a left-green party, which is my party, a center party, and a right-wing party. And a lot of people have said, is this possible to do this in a government? And I think that it's our firm conviction that we want to prove that it is possible for different political parties to cooperate and collaborate. It is obviously a very different project than be in a government with just one clear political agenda. Because you could say that our political agenda is to work against that polarization and to introduce dialogue as something that's very important in itself, even though nobody gets everything done that he or she wants to have done. And that can be difficult for politicians that want to keep their ideology completely clean, if I may say so. But I think in these times, when we see, not least with the increased use of social media and technological changes, which seem to have deepened that polarization and conflict, I think actually trying to increase understanding and dialogue is a political goal in itself. And I think maybe that is something that harmonizes well with what you are talking about here today, because peace is not just about silence, even though silence is actually wonderful and something that we don't have enough of in our modern society, because there is so much noise everywhere. Not just the normal noise the normal way, but also the noise on social media. But peace is also about dialogue and having that harmony between different sounds. And that we know very well from nature here in Iceland. When you're lying down in the grass and listening to the birds and the sea and the ocean and the rivers, and you feel that deep inner peace because of the harmony of the different sounds, I think we could learn a lot of that from that in our everyday politics too. Thank you so much for having me here, and I do hope you enjoy your stay in Iceland and this conference, and I do hope we get a more peaceful and harmonious world. Thank you.